This episode is brought to you by TakeYourSupplements.com. If you're looking for help in getting the best quality supplements for the lowest price and you want someone to work with you, a supplement expert, then go to TakeYourSupplements.com. That's TakeYourSupplements.com. TakeYourSupplements.com. Welcome to the Learn True Health podcast. I'm your host, Ashley James. This is episode 197. I am so thrilled for today's guest. We are in for such a treat. We have with us an award-winning journalist and registered dietitian, Sharon Palmer. I am so thrilled to have you here. And in fact, I announced to our Facebook group, the Learn True Health Facebook group, to all the listeners who are in the Facebook group, announced that you were coming on the show, and a bunch of them submitted their questions beforehand. So not only will I be asking you some questions, but some of our listeners will get to ask you questions as well. And I know we're in for such a treat because I'm such a huge believer in the whole foods diet, and you have so much to share around this. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Excellent. Well, I'd love for you to start by sharing your story. What led you to become this fantastic journalist and this healer through diet as the registered dietitian that you are?
Yes, well, I like to think that my story goes back to my parents. Both of my parents grew up on farms, and I'm a real believer that health, and in particular our diets and nutrition and that form of wellness really begins in the soil, with how we're growing our food and we're understanding how close our food comes to Mother Earth and that sort of thinking. So my mother grew up on a farm in Arkansas, and my father grew up on a farm in Minnesota, and they later ended up in farms in Idaho, right next door to each other, and ended up falling in love. But they then moved to the Northwest where I was born, and even when we lived in the suburbs, we had a huge vegetable garden. So I was always very connected to growing food and eating seasonal, local, real food. And then that led me to become a dietitian. I really was inspired to pursue nutrition, and I came to California and attended university at Loma Linda University, which is the home of the Blue Zones. So this is a place now famous for this kind of recognition that populations that eat a primarily plant-based diet live longer, they have less disease risk. So I studied nutrition there, and I spent a lot of time working in various healthcare settings, trying to help heal people through nutrition, and then eventually came to the journalism world, writing and speaking and talking about the power of nutrition in communications, in my books and presentations that I do, and that sort of thing.
Now, these blue zones you talk about, isn't that influenced by the Seventh Day Adventists?
Yes, it just happened to be that the Blue Zone in the United States was in a Seventh Day Adventist community, which is in Loma Linda, where they have the university, and that entire campus is meat free. It's ahead of its time with forward healthy plant based eating. And Dan Buettner actually studied blue zones around the world, these locations where people live the longest, and he identified Loma Linda as the blue zone in the United States.
I find it fascinating, and I've always had respect for the Seventh Day Adventists because, they took the Bible, the interpretation of the Bible, to the point where the body is the temple, and we're made in the image of God, and so they go, okay, well, if our body is our temple and we're made in the image of God, then we need to take care of our body because disrespecting our body would be like disrespecting God. And they have all these different ways of interpreting it. But I just thought it was really interesting that they made it sacred. Their health, their body, they made food sacred. And that is such a beautiful thing. That and now you can see that their whole communities have less disease and live longer.
Exactly. They do have a true commitment to health and nutrition as being, kind of a duty in life. And I think that was expressed in the community there, has a very high rate of Seventh Day Adventists living in that community. And in fact, that's a Seventh Day Adventist hospital and university as well. And now we have these studies coming out called the Adventist Health Study studies 1 and 2, where they actually are looking at the dietary patterns of this group of people and finding that they have all sorts of health benefits.
Very interesting. Now, you're not an advocate of 100% vegan diet, or where's your stance on healthy eating?
So, my philosophy is that everybody can benefit from eating more whole plant foods. So, that depends on the individual, what that looks like for you. I see it as a spectrum of eating so that you could be vegan if you wanted to, or you could be what I call a flexitarian, which is where we're eating less animal foods but more whole plant foods, or maybe a pescatarian or a vegetarian, whatever that looks like for you. But I just encourage people to get on that spectrum of eating more whole plant foods and less animal foods.
Got it. And when you say more whole plant foods, you're also looking at less processed foods. Is that correct?
Exactly, because a lot of our plant foods that we eat today can be junk foods. I always say, French fries and colas are plant foods. They're made from plants. So when I talk about whole plant foods, I talk about things that come close to Mother Earth, things that come close to nature. So when you eat an apple, you can see that that's a whole food. You can see the little stem where it was attached to the tree. If you eat barley, for example, whole grain barley, you can see that's an actual seed kernel and that it grew straight from the plant and it was harvested, and that's about it. So these are things that are whole, they're minimally processed, and these are the foods that we should be eating more often.
When I was 16 years old, I attempted to be a vegetarian. I mean, back then, the word vegan wasn't, at least wasn't in my vocabulary. And what I did know is stop eating meat. And so I was 16. So what I do, I ate vegetarian pizza and vegetarian subs and the fries, just everything, basically the junk food without meat. And of course, I did not get healthier. um, and so a lot of people, and I know a lot of vegetarians and vegans, and some of them will go for the packaged foods, the processed foods, just because there's no meat in it. And so you're not promoting that. What you're saying is that eat more fruits and vegetables and whole grains and unadulterated whole foods that come from the earth that you can recognize as ingredients from the earth, and you'll see better health. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and I agree with you. I see a lot of people out there who want to eat a plant-based diet, whether it's a vegan or vegetarian diet, and all they do is think about eliminating meat. That's all they're thinking. But the benefits of a plant-based diet come mostly from what you are eating, and that would be all of these whole foods, things like beans and lentils and whole grains like oats and quinoa and barley. Lots of vegetables and fruits and nuts and seeds and avocados, spices, herbs. These are all the things that should fill a healthy plant based diet.
Barnetti, one of our listeners, says, "What is your opinion on the eat right for your blood type?" Dr. Diademo suggests that an O blood type is more of a caveman, lots of protein, whereas the other blood types might prefer a vegan diet. Do you have any experience around the eat right for your blood type program?
Yeah, in my opinion, I don't think there's enough evidence to really link our blood types with what sort of diet we should be on. The research really points that a healthy diet would fit everybody's genetic profile. And when we talk about a healthy diet, we're talking about a healthy plant based diet. I mean, there's an overwhelming body of evidence that would show that that sort of diet pattern would benefit all of us. Although we are learning a little bit more in the scientific field about what we call personal nutrition or nutrigenomics, where we're starting to realize that there are certain genetic profiles of people that they might benefit from slightly tweaking their diet. So that's a new field that it's emerging. But at this point, I think we can safely say that these overall diet patterns are really healthy for most of us.
So nutrigenomics, that is a very interesting concept because some people really can't handle dairy. Or, for example, when we look at the Native American populations, they are affected much differently from alcohol consumption than from other genetic makeups, other races. So, are you saying with nutrigenomics, if there are certain people who should avoid dairy, or certain people that should avoid eggs, or are there certain cultures that do better with different food categories? Can you give some examples to that?
Yeah, you listed some great examples there. For example, lactose intolerance. A lot of people don't realize that most of the world is lactose intolerant. And that is actually a genetic predisposition that allows people to digest lactose, which lactose is the component in milk that a lot of people have trouble digesting. So, that's an example of people that have a genetic profile that a particular food does not agree with them, and that's probably one of the most common ones we could think of. But there are other things. For example, we know that certain ethnic populations are more prone to diabetes or central obesity, for example. So, we're having epidemics of diabetes in certain countries now as they're moving to this Western diet, which is the way Americans eat, that has been linked with many diseases. But when certain populations are consuming this kind of a processed food diet, they are having severe complications with obesity and diabetes. So we know that you could have a genetic profile that would make you at higher risk for certain things like heart disease or diabetes or even cancer, for example. So you may benefit from a slightly different diet than somebody else might.
They'd benefit even more from a plant-based diet.
Exactly. Like, for example, if your genetic profile has a high risk of heart disease, you would benefit from a diet pattern that would be very protective of your heart, such as maybe a Mediterranean diet or a very plant-based diet.
Hmm. Now, Barnetti also asked. She was when she was diagnosed with cancer. She This was a few years ago. She did not have anemia, but went plant based to help support her body in eliminating her breast cancer, and eating a plant-based diet, basically no meat. She ended up becoming extremely anemic. She wants to know how do people who go more plant-based avoid anemia?
Yeah, that's a very common question. Anemia is usually, we're talking about iron deficiency when we talk about anemia. So when people aren't getting enough iron, they have lower hemoglobin and hematocrit levels in their blood, which is a form of anemia. And that's a serious condition. You can feel lethargic and tired and weak and short of breath. So it's something we want to correct. But there are two types of iron in our diets. One that we call heme iron, which is the animal food iron. It's actually found in the blood of animals. And then we have plant iron, which is called non-heme iron. And there is quite a bit of iron in a lot of plant foods. If you're eating a lot of whole grains and legumes, green leafy vegetables, nuts and seeds, these kinds of things, you'll be getting sources of iron. And I always recommend for plant-based eaters, to be checked by their physician once a year and check for, anemia, the presence of anemia. But I eat a strictly plant-based diet, and I haven't ever had an issue with anemia. But I know many people have, so it's very important for them to make sure they're getting sources of plant-based iron in the diet. Another thing is vitamin C. At the same time you're eating at your meals can increase the absorption of iron significantly. And when you're eating a plant-based diet, you should be getting a lot of vitamin C. That would be things like fruits and vegetables. So that's one of the benefits of eating, this diet filled with plant foods. And then if for some reason you're having a hard time with that, you could supplement your diet with iron, which I've seen many people have to do when, even omnivores have had to supplement their diet with iron if they're having some issues there.
Hmm. And she could add a small amount of high iron meat, making sure that most of her, like what you're saying, is that it's okay to have small amounts of meat. You're more focusing on more vegetables, more whole foods. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's different. I mean, if somebody is really committed to a vegetarian or vegan diet, I think they can successfully have good iron stores in their body if they're eating well. I always recommend someone to see a dietitian and have them help plan their diet to make sure they are meeting their needs. But at the same time, I think that if your diet preference is to have small amounts of meat, that's another way you could do it. There is iron in the animal foods, especially like the red meats, and as well as, um, you know, poultry and fish as well. So that's another option. I really think that the diet preference when it comes to plant-based is an individual choice. Like how far you want to go in the
Mm.
plant-based world is your personal decision.
I like that you say that you're not shaming people for eating meat or shaming people for not eating meat. It's not about that. It's about finding their true health, right? And dialing in their diet, because one person's poison could be another person's medicine. The lactose, for example, the and the casein in dairy. Those who can digest it kind of look at all of us who are dairy free and go, what are you guys doing? Dairy is great, and they just I've been shamed before for being dairy free, and all I have to do is tell them, listen, I don't feel good when I eat that way, and hopefully they can understand that. So we're not here to shame anyone for being vegan or not being vegan, but I definitely want my listeners to learn a better way of eating that and gives them even more health. For those who, and I love playing the devil's advocate, for those who would argue, well, if I eat lots of whole foods, I eat lots of vegetables and fruit and lots of whole grains and legumes and nuts and seeds, and I'm vegan, and I still develop anemia. Wouldn't that mean that my body is meant to eat meat? What would you say to those people who argue that point?
That point can be made about vitamin B12 as well. That is the true vitamin that you have to supplement. You can't find it on a plant-based diet. So, you could use that argument. And indeed, humans are omnivores. We have evolved to eat animal foods and plant foods. So, that's why I feel like that this is a personal choice, where you want to be on this spectrum. And if you feel that that is something that you want to do, have small amounts of animal foods, then I think that's fine, and that's what's good for you. But for many people that want to embrace a more plant-based diet, my thinking is that I'm on a 100% plant-based diet because I feel that when I eat this way, I make the least impact on the planet.
Mm.
So, that's my personal choice. I have the lowest carbon footprint of anybody. Vegans have the lowest carbon footprint, and we have no impact on animal wealth, animal harm, we're not harming animals. So that's my personal choice. And as long as I meet my nutritional needs and I'm eating a healthy, whole foods, plant-based diet, I go to the doctor once a year and I check my levels, and they're all great. But I wouldn't, if somebody is having a hard time keeping their iron up, then I think that's a completely legitimate option for them to consider eating smaller portions of animal protein to help them meet their needs. One of the things I always like to point out is that the reason I'm really passionate about eating more plants and reducing animal food is because Americans just eat so much. We're eating
Mm.
three times the global rate of meat. So, my dream is that, what if we could just shift our diets back and eat more whole foods, and we would really help our environment as well as animal welfare and our health, because these kinds of diets, the Western diet, high in animal foods, we know it's been linked with many health risks.
I encourage listeners to drive by a cattle farm, like a real industrial sized cattle farm, because I got to tell you, I'm a meat eater. I love meat. But I've changed my diet a lot in the last 7 years to adapt way more of a plant based diet, and I have reduced my meat consumption significantly. In driving by, like in California, you'll drive by off the highway for miles and miles. You'll see these cows, no grass. They have no room, and the stench is horrific, absolutely horrific. I'm sure they're in Texas, and they're probably in every state. But when I've driven through Northern California to drive down from Seattle to LA, we drive by these cattle farms, and it makes me want to be vegan. It makes me want to like just open the gates and let them all free, because it's so inhumane, and they they are showing that the emissions from the farm animals is tremendous, and but not only that, I mean, all the animals are suffering, and I'd rather have us consume less meat and then have the animals not suffer. And so then we're not consuming the flesh of a suffered animal. So I totally get your perspective on that. And I also respect that what you're saying is that um, if their health is suffering, then they need to make sure that their nutritional needs are met, which may also include small amounts of meat, but also could include supplements. Actually, a few of the listeners asked about the vitamin B12 deficiency that comes with a fully plant based diet. What do you recommend vegans do or vegetarians do to supplement? So, do you have specific brands you recommend, or um, specific tests that they can do to make sure that their um, blood levels are within normal ranges?
Yes, I recommend that if you're on a vegan, and even vegetarians should be aware of their B12 status, because B12 is found primarily in animal foods, and vegetarians, it's not really high in dairy foods, so vegetarians could be low too. So I recommend that number one, you take 100% of the RDA for vitamin B12 every day. I mean, some of the vitamin B12 supplements are larger dose, so you might have to do it a few times a week. But 100% of the RDA should be the goal. And some studies show that it should be even higher than 100% of the RDA, because we absorb vitamin B12 so poorly. And this is one fact that a lot of people don't know, is that the National Institutes for Health now recommends that anybody over the age of 50 should be taking B12, because we absorb B12 so poorly. And B12 is very important for your cognition and for many many issues. So anyway, but I do recommend having your B12 tested when if you are vegetarian and vegan once a year when you go to the doctor, to make sure that you're supplementing appropriately. Encourage people to choose brands that have a good reputation, that have a third party validation on the label, just a general well recognized supplement brand when you're choosing supplements.
Got it. Now, what are some macronutrient profiles that you recommend? Do you want to make sure that those who are adapting more plant based make sure they're consuming more healthy fats? A lot of times when people go more vegan or vegetarian, they end up consuming more carbs, although healthy carbs, and then they consume less protein and less healthy fats. Um, what do you recommend? What are the ratios that you recommend people strive for?
Yeah, that's a good point, because you will see a lot of people when they move to a plant-based diet, they're really loading up on the carbohydrates. Although I want to really set the record straight that carbohydrates are not all bad. People have this fear of carbohydrates right now that is not justified. And in fact, when you look at healthy diet patterns around the world where people live the longest, they tend to be very high in carbohydrates in terms of a percentage of their calories. So we can't just assume that carbs are bad. However, it's the quality of carbs that I like to really stress. So the quality of carbs, when we're eating these whole foods, these are the quality of carbs that we want to be consuming. So instead of a refined flour, we want to, choose the whole grains, especially in their intact form. That would be the very best way to eat these starchy foods. So, for example, eating a bowl of cooked quinoa or brown rice, or cooked rye berries, farro. These would have the best response in your body compared to when these grains are refined or turned into a flour. So really focusing more on those, and then getting more pulses or legumes. Those are things like beans and lentils. And these have protein. This is an important source of protein on a plant-based diet. So I recommend having at least one serving for everybody, no matter what your diet is, having one serving of these pulses or these beans, lentils, because they're so high in protein. They can take the place of animal food on your plate. And we have many studies that are linking health benefits with consuming these more often. So balancing the diet, with these healthy carbohydrates, these protein sources. Other sources of protein are things like soy foods, things like tofu, and then the healthy fats, like you mentioned. things like nuts and seeds, which also have protein, but healthy fats, avocado, olives, olive oil, extra virgin olive oil is the one I recommend. Making sure your plate is balanced with representation of all those foods on the plate will really make sure that you have this balanced diet.
I love that you brought up the beans. Forrest asks, what is your opinion on sprouting like mung bean sprouts?
So yeah, there's different kinds of sprouting, and people get confused about this. There's something called sprouted grains or sprouted beans, and when we talk about that, we're talking about germination, which means that the seed is soaked and then it's allowed to be warm, and it literally sprouts a tiny bit, but it's barely visible, and so that would be called a sprouted grain or a bean. But then we have full sprouts. So when you think of alfalfa sprouts or bean sprouts, where you see a healthy amount of the sprout, a couple inches. Those are the two categories of sprouted grains and beans that we have. Research shows that when you have germinated grains and beans, I'm talking about just that little tiny bit of sprout, it changes the profile of that food and may make it healthier for you. It may make it easier to digest and make the nutrients more bioavailable to your body. So I like that trend. And then when you have this full sprouted legume or bean, then you get the benefits. You're almost looking at a vegetable then, so you get a different nutrient profile.
Right, you're eating food that's alive. You get all the enzymes and the energy, the vibration from a food that's alive. I love sprouts. I feel more energized when I include sprouted foods, especially the large sprouts, like you had mentioned. Do you notice that about certain foods that you feel almost like you consume the energy force of that plant? You feel alive after eating it?
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of a plant-based diet. And I know I love to tell people to get back to nature when you're thinking about your food. I'm a huge advocate of growing your own food, going to farmers markets where you see things that have literally been harvested, a couple hours from the earth. You can still see the earth on the roots of the carrots and that kind of thing. And I think when we're so connected to our food, there's so many rewards. We know that there are rewards nutritionally. We know that when foods are harvested at their peak, they're at their prime nutritionally too. And we know that studies show now in our modern food system, it takes about 2 weeks from harvest before you're eating a fresh piece of produce, depending on the produce you're talking about. And in that 2 week period of time, it's losing nutritional value. So, I think there is so much about this idea of getting more connected to our food. And I absolutely agree that when we're eating all of these alive foods, we feel better. I hear from people all the time when they start eating more plants that they feel better, they look better, their skin is better. There's less inflammation, which is one of the benefits of eating more plants because they're filled with antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds.
Perfect. And now another listener, Jennifer, shares that she cares for elderly people in their homes, and she'd love to hear you talk about specific things that she could do to help them, or what can we do to help an aging generation through supplements or through diet, especially those who, maybe a generation who's never thought about being vegan, right? What can we do to help this aging generation to gain all the health they can gain?
Yeah, that's really interesting because I meet a lot of older people who want to eat a plant-based diet, and they'll ask me, "Am I too old to do this?" And I think you're never too old. You're never too old to eat better and to fill your body with these healthful ingredients, healthful nutrients, compounds that reduce inflammation. So I think that it's depends on the person and how far they want to go. But even just starting to increase the amount of plant foods on the plate is a huge start. To have a couple of meals that are based on legumes, beans or lentils or black-eyed peas, those kinds of things, with lots of fruits and vegetables during that day is really a great place to start. Looking at ways to put that on the plate. I know sometimes older people may have smaller appetites. So finding ways, maybe breaking it up into small feedings during the day, and also looking, looking at levels to make sure, the blood levels are fine in terms of iron, B12, those kinds of things. Folate is another common deficiency among older people, and that is very prominent in plant foods. If they're eating a lot of plant foods, they can replace that. So looking at those nutrients that might be in short supply is important too.
Very cool. Excellent. Now, what about the inflammatory impact of lectins? Hall, a listener asks about lectins and their the impact that they have on the body. Do you have any expertise around that?
Yeah, this is a common thing that's come up. Lectins are kind of a form of anti-nutrient. So this is a whole category of compounds found in plant foods. Um, and anti-nutrients is this kind of general term that we refer to compounds in plant foods that may block the absorption of nutrients, or maybe, some sort of inflammatory or something like that. So there are these compounds that are naturally found, and they're prevalent in greater supply in things like beans and grains, but they're also found in other plant foods like green leafy vegetables. So the thing about lectins, these are most commonly related to beans and lentils and the pulse group, is that they can be minimized through soaking and cooking, and that is the main thing that we need to know. People aren't realizing that some of the studies that have been done on lectins were using raw beans. So when you look at that they're inflammatory, it's because they're raw, and this is one food that we cannot consume raw. They have to be soaked and cooked, and it denatures these anti-nutrients. Another thing is sprouting helps reduce them as well, which is another reason why I like the sprouting trend going on. So overall, the studies have shown very consistent results that people who eat more of these pulses have lower inflammation levels, have a lower risk of heart disease, diabetes, all of these certain types of cancer. So we know that they're good for us and they reduce our risk of these diseases, but it's just a matter of understanding these compounds and how we can reduce them in our diet, because we certainly do not want to stop eating plant foods. We know this is the healthy way to go. And one other little factor is that scientists are starting to understand anti-nutrients a little better. And there are some scientists who actually believe that maybe anti-nutrients are good for us because they're found in plants. And for example, fiber is technically an anti-nutrient. At one time, they thought fiber wasn't good for us because it actually interferes with the absorption of nutrients. Fiber will get in the way of you absorbing all of the nutrients in a food, but now we know that fiber is really, really good for us. So it could be the same with a lot of these compounds. We may find that they actually have a reason for being in the plant, and they may be beneficial for us.
Right. I was so excited to hear the role that fiber plays, that if we eat a diet without fiber, our intestines will reabsorb the toxins that our liver spent so much time eliminating, because the liver filters our blood and then puts the toxins in the gallbladder to be excreted into the small intestines to be then swept away by bowel movements. But if we don't eat fiber, the body reabsorbs the toxins, and so fiber is that carrier that helps to eliminate all the waste, all the toxins, and that is so important. So yeah, it does prevent some absorption of the nutrition, but I would rather prevent some nutrition absorption and remove all the toxins than absorb my nutrition and reabsorb all my toxins.
Exactly. In fact, this is one area of research right now that looks pretty solid, and that's colon cancer. There's a specific, you know, relationship between colon cancer and diet. It's probably the most solid relationship in cancer in terms of the diet relationship. And a high red meat diet has been linked to higher risk of risk over again, colon cancer risk. And it's thought that this high fiber plant-based diet helps, just push everything through more quickly, which would, reduce the amount of time for any toxins to be in contact with the colon. The more quickly we get things through, the less exposure time to these, maybe toxic compounds in the intestinal tract. So it just kind of goes along with what you're talking about.
Hmm. Now, I have always been one that I'm really I listen to my body after I eat, and I've always found that if I skip protein, so skip, meat, for example, for a few meals, I feel lightheaded. I don't feel grounded. I don't really feel in my body, and and I don't feel like I feel more ethereal. I don't feel really like clear-headed. Does that make sense? How can you prevent this? If someone wants to stop eating meat or eat significantly less meat, but they notice that they just don't feel grounded when they eat less meat, what should they do? What should they add to their diet?
I have the exact same experience when I don't eat protein too. It's hard to explain, but it's just that feeling where I feel like my body's hungry, like I'm not getting everything that I need. And I've heard other people who have complained about similar results when they're trying to eat more plant-based and they're not getting protein or fat. I hear that with fat too. When your diet is too high in carbohydrates and you just don't feel full or like your nutritional needs are being met, like your body's crying out for more. I've heard that from many people. And so my recommendation is to make sure you are getting good sources of carbohydrates, which are easy to get, but also the protein and the fat in the diet and balancing it out. So I always recommend at least one serving of plant protein. If you're eating a 100% plant-based diet, make sure you get plant protein at each meal. And that would be things like, the beans, the lentils, tofu, tempeh, nuts like peanuts are very high in protein, pistachios, almonds, those are high in protein. And then some healthy fats, things like a little olive oil in your salad or some olives or avocados, those kinds of things. And, balancing it out, making sure you're including those in a meal.
Um, Now I'm thinking you can get lots of omega 3s from plant-based fats. What about omega 6? How does one get enough omega 6 from a vegan diet?
So omega-6 is pretty easy to get. It's found in a lot of the normal oils that people cook with, a lot of the common cooking oils, and it's also found in a lot of the other other plant foods that might be rich in fat, such as nuts and seeds. The omega-3s, as you mentioned, usually are coming in a plant-based diet. They're usually coming from plant omega-3s, such as chia seeds, hemp seeds, walnuts. Those are some of the really good sources of the omega-3s. However, the long chain omega-3s, such as those found in fish, the DHA and EPA, are, you really can't get that in a plant-based diet except for algae. So you're starting to see
Ooh.
these algae oil supplements. And really, that is where fish get their omega-3s to begin with. So
Shut
they're,
up. Wait a
yeah,
second. Wait a
yeah,
second. So we could just skip eating the fish altogether, go straight to the source where the fish get it?
right. We could, the algae oil. Yeah, and it's much more sustainable because it's much more sustainable to grow algae than it would be to, there's a lot of concern about how sustainable omega-3 supplements are because you're getting them from fish. You're all of these fish, although, some argue that this is fish that normally wouldn't be consumed, but all of this fish is being caught and processed to turn into omega-3s, fish oil supplements. So algae would be a much more sustainable way. And basically, the fish get algae through their food chain. So little fish eat algae and then slightly bigger fish eat those little fish all the way to you have the large fish like salmon that are really rich in omega-3s. So they're just concentrating the omega-3s through the food chain. So we could be taking algae supplements, and you're seeing more and more of those available. DHA and EPA. They'll say vegetarian DHA and EPA. So I recommend those for people who are eating a 100% plant-based diet and avoiding fish, because that form of omega-3 seems to be more beneficial. And the human body can convert the plant omega-3s to these long chain omega-3s, but it's at very low rates. So these are not only important for our hearts, but they're also important for our brains. So I tend to think that the algae oil is a good thing for us to consider using if you're avoiding fish.
What about just consuming algae? I'm gluten free, so I always look for different types of pasta. And my health food store has this package that's in like the refrigerated section that's algae pasta,
Hmm.
and it's an acquired taste. But it's kind of fun to experiment. So, what about eating algae straight, or is it better to take the supplement if we want to make sure we're getting enough of that omega?
I'm a huge fan of all this new product innovation out there. I have not tried that and I haven't looked at the label. I would just be curious to see, how much omega-3 was in that product. But, I'm a fan of eating it in as whole a form as possible. I would much rather see us eat our food in the whole form rather than the supplement. The supplement should be just that, a supplement to a healthy diet. So I would be curious to look at that particular product. Um, but I'm also loving these. Have you tried these pulse pastas, like the lentil and the
Oh
bean
yes.
pastas? They're so good. They taste good and they're really high in protein.
Yes, absolutely. They're actually our favorite pasta here in our household. My son loves them. We now get them at Trader Joe's actually. Trader Joe's has some great black bean pasta and red lentil pasta, but I've tried the chickpea pasta, of course, quinoa pasta. But I really like the ones that are made with lentils, like green lentils or orange lentils. I notice that my blood sugar maintains its stability when I eat that pasta versus like just a rice pasta, which is really cool. Actually, there's a lot of protein in those lentil or bean pastas, and so I feel like I'm cheating because I'm getting a big bowl of pasta, but I'm actually getting a big bowl of protein and fiber. So yeah, and I notice my body buzzes after eating it, like it feels good, like I got a good amount of protein from it.
Right. And these are a very significant contribution to protein. When we think about a serving of protein, we think about 7 grams. So some of these uh, pulse pastas are providing like somewhere around 25 grams of protein. So that's like 3 ounces of meat that you're talking about. So that's a nice contribution. So technically, you could just serve that with a roasted vegetable sauce and you've got a balanced meal.
Very cool. Share some more ideas. I like that you paint this picture with some meals so that people can start to feel comfortable with making this transition. Maybe share like what you've eaten for the last few days.
Yeah, I love to just tell people when you're trying to move more to plant-based, a lot of times people just don't know where to start. And I like to tell people to just start thinking about your plate differently because a lot of times, we think about meals and we start with the animal food. We ask ourselves, oh, what are we going to cook for dinner tonight? And we always think, will it be chicken or beef or fish? But what if we started with a plant food? What if we started by thinking, um, I went to the farmer's market and I got that beautiful cauliflower. What should I do with the cauliflower tonight? So I like that idea. And that's kind of the way I plan my meals. I go to the farmer's market. And of course, I live in California, so I'm very spoiled. We have amazing farmer's markets. But I'm seeing them all over the United States. They are on the rise. I'm seeing CSAs where people can get a produce box, and that can really inspire your cooking. So I actually was inspired last night to make something that's going to be on my blog soon, but it's called Three Sisters Chili. I don't. Have you heard of the story of three sisters?
No, please tell it.
Okay, so I love this story. It's a Native American tradition, and it goes back to 1000 AD. All over the Americas, there was this form of agriculture, and it was called the Three Sisters. So the Native Americans would plant maize, which is corn, and then they would plant that in a mound, and then they would plant a bean at the base, and the bean would use the corn stalk as its pole. And then at the base, they would also plant some kind of a squash. And the squash would create this canopy to protect, protect the moisture, to shade too much sun from the plants. And the beans would put nitrogen in the soil because we know legumes are nitrogen fixing. They actually can convert nitrogen in the soil to like a natural fertilizer. So they planted these three things together, and that was their form of agriculture. And it was the backbone of their diet. I love this whole thing with, the beans and the squashes and the corn as this backbone of their diet. So I made a chili based on the Three Sisters. It has acorn squash. It has heritage red kidney beans, and then I used frozen corn. And then on top of that, I did some research on what spices the Native Americans had in their spice cabinet. And I found that they had sage. They used a lot of sage. They used wild mint, tarragon, and chilies, and then juniper berries. So I added that spice blend, which is a very unusual spice blend. So I really liked that story from that one recipe, and it was really delicious. My whole family loved it.
That sounds amazing. It sounds very delicious, wonderful. So, and I love that they figured out the agriculture of those three combined. It just amazes me what we accomplished before computers. Like, I think we've almost gotten stupider after getting smartphones because we've given up so much of our thinking to just Googling it. But they, without any computers, figured out that this was the best strategy. That these three together grew optimally, and that is so cool. And that together when we eat them, they work for our body. So what other maybe let's talk about breakfasts. What do you recommend to have more of a whole foods plant-based breakfast?
Yeah, well, my favorite go-to breakfast is steel cut oats. I have it on most mornings because it's just this, nice fiber profile. It's very satiating. And then I usually enjoy it with whatever seasonal fruit. Again, whatever is in season. I've been doing persimmons lately because those are gorgeous and in season right now. And then I will use some sort of a nut, like walnuts or pistachios or almonds or peanuts, whatever, hemp seeds sometimes, and that's my protein. And then I will use some soy milk. I use soy milk. So that's kind of my go-to breakfast. But then I like to mix it up every once in a while to maybe have like a tofu veggie scramble with whole wheat toast or something like that too.
Very cool. And what about some lunches, especially those of us who are so busy, so on the go? I know a lot of a concern of many listeners who brought this up with me is that they're so busy that they leave the house and they just don't have time until they get home late at night. What are some ways that we can pack our lunch on the go to make sure that it's a healthy one, but also that it tastes good a few hours later?
Yeah, you're right. I hear the same thing from so many people. And, we're also busy. And I like this new trend. I don't know if you've seen it called meal prepping. It's where people actually kind of assemble their meals, especially their lunches, perhaps. Maybe on Sunday night, they box them all up and then they just grab it for
Hmm.
to go. And I think that works really well for people for lunch. It's really hard to have a healthy meal when you're eating out for lunch. I mean, studies have shown that people who eat at fast foods more often eat poor quality diets, and they have more troubles with obesity and other chronic diseases. And it's easy to see a lot of our fast food restaurants. You don't have very many healthful options, although it is getting better. So I'm a big fan of trying to bring your own lunch because then you can really control the ingredients. And one of my favorite things that I can prep for lunch is just a huge salad. And when I eat a salad, it has to satisfy me. It can't just be a little wimpy salad with, three nuts on it. It has to be fulfilling. It has to be a meal in one. So I always like to start with a bed of greens, and I like really pungent greens like chard or bok choy or kale. That's my preference. The darker, the better. We know the more darker colored greens have more nutrients. And then I always add some sort of a grain for that healthy carbs, such as maybe cooked quinoa, or, I could cook a pot and then just use a little bit that is in the refrigerator. And then maybe I'll open a can of chickpeas and put some chickpeas on there, and lots of veggies, whatever I have on hand, whether it's tomatoes or artichoke hearts or broccoli florets, just load it up with that, and then a really delicious vinaigrette. And a lot of times I'll pack that on the side, so that I can add that at the last minute. And that's one of my favorite go-to lunches. And you can change it up. Someday you could have a different kind of green. You could have a different healthy protein on there, whatever vegetables you have on hand. It doesn't get boring. It's satisfying, and you're just, packing in all these nutrients.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I've gotten into the habit of doing salads for breakfast, and although I'm not vegan, I do have eggs. So I make a delicious salad, and I do my own fermenting. That's something that I've learned from several of the guests I've interviewed, is how important it is to eat fermented foods. And so I'll chop up a pickle that I have personally fermented, or I have fermented raw ginger, a purple cabbage, and my favorite is watermelon radish. They're these giant radishes that are really beautiful, and when you ferment them just with a brine, they become the most succulent, most delicious thing you've ever tasted in a salad. And so then I'll add whatever fermented food. I'll add some mixed greens, like you said. Choose different. I get a variety, so like I'll do baby kale one day, or spinach another day, or a bunch of leftover cold greens that are in my fridge from a sautéed the night before, and then I'll add a healthy oil, um, and the fermented foods, and any juice from the fermented foods, like just pickle brine, for example. Cut up an avocado and add a bunch of seeds, like pumpkin seeds, and then I put my eggs over easy on top, and that's my breakfast. And sometimes that's my lunch too, because I've been playing around with them so much. But I find that it's so satiating, to play around with different salads, and like you said, it doesn't get boring because you're constantly playing around with all the ingredients, and you're getting so much vegetables into you. And I notice that when I go on a kick and I'm eating one or two of these big salads a day, I feel so good, and regular bowel movements. My body's eliminating the toxins, and I feel like less inflammation. I really feel a difference in my energy levels. So I love your suggestion. That's very cool. Um, what what are some interesting vegetables that you've gotten in a CSA box? What's like the most interesting vegetable you've ever gotten that kind of surprised you when you opened up your box?
Well, first of all, I have to say, I want one of your breakfasts. One of these. It sounds so good. And I've been reading about breakfast salads getting more popular, and I'm a huge fan of fermented foods. So I applaud you. And I love watermelon radish. So you really, you really scored big with me there. But I have to say, now that I have been going to the farmers market and involved with the CSA for a few years, I'm not as surprised as I used to be. But I think the thing that really surprised me is all of the varieties that plant foods come in. And I think most people don't realize, for example, the carrots come in purple and yellow and white and rainbow when you cut into them, different colors. Or that, like you say, the radishes, they're watermelon radishes. I've seen, you know, all these, they call them Easter egg radishes, and every color of the red and pink spectrum. I've seen purple kohlrabi and purple asparagus, purple. Well, it's actually red okra. So most of us think of green okra, but there's a red variety. So I just love being introduced to new varieties, because in our supermarkets often we're just getting the same variety over and over again. But there's so much diversity. For example, in the tomato world, most of us, we're starting to embrace heirloom tomatoes, but there are 25,000 types of tomatoes. So when we look at each plant species, there's so much variety, and I think that It can add more nutritional value, and it can make it so much more fun and appealing.
When we eat like these, like you said, nutritional value, when we eat different types of tomatoes, are we really getting different types of nutrients, or when we eat a variety of vegetables, they're obviously grown in different regions, so we're more likely to get a variety of trace minerals?
So the major difference in all these varieties is the phytochemicals. And phytochemicals are these plant compounds. We just learned about them in the last few decades, and now we know there are thousands and thousands of plant compounds. And scientists think that plants evolved these compounds to protect themselves. And a lot of times, these phytochemicals, these compounds, um, they act as some sort of a protection for the plant. Like they act as sunscreen. They can protect the plant from viruses or pests. A lot of times they are the color compound in a plant. So, for example, one famous example is lycopene, which is a red pigment. So lycopene is this phytochemical in tomatoes, but it's also what is making it red. So a lot of these phytochemicals are the color marker, and we know that they have so many benefits. They have antioxidant properties, they have anti-inflammatory properties, and now research has linked them. For example, anthocyanins are what makes blue foods that beautiful dark purple blue, like blueberries, for example. And those compounds have been linked with brain protection. And the lycopene, that red compound, has been linked with prostate cancer prevention. So by having this variety of colorful foods, we're complementing our diets with all these different phytochemicals. Instead of just having a couple of them, we're just amplifying the different types that are in plants.
I love that you brought this up. I'm a really big advocate of supplementation, of taking supplements, because we don't get all of the 77 trace minerals. It's very hard to make sure that we get all of them because of the farming practices. As you know, the farming practices of the last 150 years have depleted most of our soil, especially when it's quote unquote conventionally grown with glyphosate and all the other chemicals, which now we know are chelators. So when they spray the chemicals on the plants to as herbicides or pesticides, that a lot of these chemicals will bind to minerals, bind to the trace minerals in the soil and wash them away, leaving the soil more and more void. And so I really like the idea of supplementing, but there's this idea that people get in their mind that, oh, I took my supplements and so I can go to McDonald's. Like I took my supplements and I can eat whatever I want. You can't out supplement a bad diet, just like you can't out exercise a bad diet. It all comes back to having a good diet as the primary source of nutrition, and supplements should be just that. It should be a supplement to a good diet. And I love that you brought up phytochemicals, because something like broccoli has over 1,000 of them, of all those phytonutrients, and we just can't replicate that in a good supplement. We definitely could get our vitamins and our minerals, but you're not going to get these in the quantities that you can when just eating a few cups of broccoli. You're not going to get that from a supplement. Now, there's this concept that eating raw, you're actually going to have more access to the phytochemicals than if it's lightly steamed or if it's cooked altogether. What is your take on the nutrient value of eating raw versus eating cooked vegetables?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of confusion about the raw versus cooked. And when it comes to phytochemicals, it's actually a little bit mixed. And nutrients overall. So some nutrients are very heat sensitive. The moment you cook something, you lose, that would be vitamin C, and some of the B vitamins are the ones we think about. And also they can be oxidized. The moment you peel something or you cut into it, you start losing those nutrients. So that would, the benefit would be eating it as whole as possible, as fresh as possible, because as I mentioned before, studies are showing that certain nutrients, we lose them the greater time after harvest. So the longer it's going after harvest, we're losing nutritional value bit by bit. But then there are other nutrients that are more available the more we mess with the plant, and that would be the carotenoid group, and that would be like the lycopene and the beta carotene. Those nutrients, it the studies are showing that when we disrupt the cell wall, it actually lets it become more available. So when you cook it, for example, cooked tomatoes, the lycopene is more bioavailable, significantly more bioavailable, because we disrupt the cell wall. It makes it easier for our bodies to get at that nutrient. So my whole take is that we should have both. We should enjoy, some fresh fruits and vegetables and some cooked. I mean, some we clearly have to cook. As I was mentioning, the whole grains and the pulses, we have to cook those. Those are not good for us unless we cook them. But we can have both in our diets. We can have some fresh and raw, and then we can have some cooked.
Got it. And is there how would we know what foods are best raw and what foods are best cooked, or just basically play around with it?
Well, the vitamin C rich fruits and vegetables tend to be better fresh. So that would be your your vegetables like uh, bell peppers and broccoli. I'm trying to think of some of the vitamin C of your fruits. Things like berries, for example, are very rich in vitamin C. Tomatoes, that's one of those situations where the vitamin C is going to be higher in fresh, but the lycopene is going to be higher in the processed. So, my kind of general rule for that is when it's seasonal, I like to have those things fresh when they're in season. For example, right now, berries aren't really in season, so I would rather have things when they're in season. So I'll be enjoying dried berries and more frozen berries right now, but I'm switching to the apples and pears right now, and I'm going to enjoy those fresh because they're in season. I'm going to be having my persimmon. I'm going to be having my squashes, my green leafy vegetables. Now, green leafy vegetables such as kale and spinach, some of those nutrients are going to be more available in fresh, but you can concentrate the spinach when you're cooking it. You can get a lot more into a serving size. So there are different ways of looking at it. But again, I think the bottom line message is that we try to enjoy both of those in the diet.
Got it. Very cool. Now, what about nutritional studies when it comes to organic versus non-organic? At first I kept seeing studies that say there's no difference, but then studies came out that said there's a huge difference, and I'm more likely to believe that there's a big difference between organic and non-organic. What's your take on it?
Yeah, this is a good question. And, there are a couple of big landmark studies here. One of the big studies from Stanford found that there were not a lot of nutritional differences between conventional and organic produce. But we also have studies that have shown that there are higher phytochemical levels in the organic versus conventional. And that would make sense because those phytochemicals that we were talking about, they were in the nature's defense system.
Mm.
So, when a plant had to mount a defense, it would have more phytochemicals. And we've seen this in the studies. They actually found that when a piece of fruit had a scab on it or had some sort of an insult, it had more antioxidants present right there because that plant had to mount a defense.
So the ugly fruit is healthier for us.
Yes, it has more phytochemicals. So, so it would make sense that organic produce has to struggle a little bit more. It's not pampered, it's not sprayed with things that fight off all of the predators. So it would make sense that those pieces of produce would have higher levels of phytochemicals. So that, we do have evidence on that. But my whole philosophy about organic versus conventional is not so much about the nutrients, but it's about our environment, about our communities, because this way of agriculture, organic agriculture, is better for communities, it's better for waterways, it's far lower in pesticide contamination that's getting into the soil and the waterways in our communities. It's preserving a more sustainable way of agriculture. It's helping protect our soil. You talked about the soil. Organic agriculture is much better for the soil. So my main reason to support organic has to do with how we're growing the food.
Hmm. In When I was pregnant, my naturopath, who has been practicing for over 30 years, and she was actually the dean of Bastyr University, a naturopathic university here in Seattle. She basically said to me, "Listen, I'm glad you're on the west coast of Washington, because on the east coast of Washington, if you're pregnant at a certain stage in your pregnancy during the time in which they're spraying the crops, because eastern Washington is mostly, lots of farmland, uh, the birth defects go through the roof, undeniably through the roof. And of course, we don't hear about this because these big companies lobby to keep this all under wraps. You think of like Aaron Brockovich. Think about those kind of stories where it finally gets out. Well, there are areas, if you live near farm areas and they spray, and you're pregnant, you're more likely to have a miscarriage or have a baby that is born with a deformity. And if that happens to our fetus, what happens to our body over time? Why is it that 1 in 2 women in their lifetime in the United States will develop cancer, and 1 in 3 men? That statistic is ridiculous. That means that out of everyone that you know and love, almost half of them are going to have a cancer diagnosis in their lifetime. That should shock everyone into making major changes in their life, especially considering going organic. Now, on the subject of cancer, you've talked a little bit about how we can certain foods to promote cancer prevention. If someone wanted to just fully arm themselves, eating in a way that would prevent cancer, what would you tell them to do?
Well, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but the evidence is pretty strong that eating a plant-based diet is the way to go. And in fact, I love the American Institute for Cancer Research. I don't know if you've seen that resource, but they have a lot of beautiful nutrition recommendations, and they actually have recommendations about taking the plate and making it 3/4 plant foods, whole plant foods, which I think that's a nice visual. And the reason why, when we're eating this plant-based diet, is that we're filling the body with all of these phytochemicals we talked about. Cancer is an inflammatory disease. We know that. So, when we're eating all of these plant foods that are so high in anti-inflammatory compounds, we're suppressing that chronic inflammation. We're suppressing oxidative stress, which also is linked with cancer. And then the fiber, for example, fiber has been linked with especially colorectal cancer reduction, risk of cancer reduction. So these kinds of foods are beneficial for reducing the risk of cancer. So really, that plant-based diet, eating less red meat, specifically red meat, has been linked with certain types of cancer, and in particular, processed meat. So when we talk about processed, we're talking about bacon and sausage and ham. There's a pretty convincing relationship between the processed meat and cancer. And in fact, the American Institute for Cancer Research actually recommends to avoid processed meat, not even limit it, but avoid it. So there are a lot of things we can do with our diet. And really, again, eating more of those whole plant foods is a big part of it.
Absolutely. And I would say that in the processed meat, the sodium nitrate, potassium nitrite, which are chemicals, preservatives they put on the meat so the meat doesn't look like a cadaver, doesn't look gray. Dr. Wallach, who's a naturopathic physician I study from, he used to be a pathologist before he became a naturopath, and saw that processed meats, so nitrates and nitrites in the meats, would clog the kidneys and cause so much inflammation in the kidneys that people would develop kidney disease, even though there was nothing wrong with the kidney. It was simply inflammation at the very core of the kidney. And once people who have kidney disease remove nitrates and nitrates and increase their antioxidants in their diet, that their kidney disease subsides. He also saw that the chemicals in processed meats would cross the blood-brain barrier and cause inflammation there as well. So it's pretty scary that we walk into the grocery store naive and trusting that all the food there won't harm us. Like, yeah, we know that maybe Cheetos or whatever, Doritos, or we know that some foods aren't healthy, but we don't think to ourselves, this is going to cause cancer if I eat it 25 times or 250 times. We don't think to ourselves that what I'm eating is a ticking time bomb, because we walk in a bit naive, trusting that, if there was something really dangerous, the government wouldn't allow it. right? The government wouldn't allow that chemical to be in our food. And yet that's just not how it works. How it works is something has to harm enough people and enough ruckus has to be made for then it to finally be removed. Now you're seeing a wave of nitrate free meats, right? Or you see more and more organic food and more organic meats, and that's because we're voting with our forks. If we don't vote with our fork, then the industry won't bend the knee to our desires. And so I love what you're saying is that you're looking to impact the world with how you eat, and if enough of us do that, we will impact the world. You had mentioned that other countries that used to be healthier are now, because they're adapting the American diet, they are becoming less and less healthy. It is known that many countries emulate how we eat, and you see McDonald's proliferates these communities. And I'm using McDonald's as one example, but basically all the fast food industries will come into these areas where they used to eat a healthy traditional diet, and within one generation, they now have adapted the heart disease rates and the cancer rates that we have. And so
Right.
by us changing, and if we want to change the world, we need to change because America is how many countries want to eat how we eat. Does that make sense? So the more we change, the more we vote with our fork, we'll not only be changing our health, we'll change America, and the countries that emulate us will then follow suit.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we're seeing this proliferation of the Western diet, and that is an actual scientific term. There are characteristics of the Western diet. It's a diet, the typical diet in America and Europe, where people eat a high meat diet and high processed food diet, lots of restaurant fast foods, prepared foods. So that diet pattern is high in calories, saturated fat, sodium, sugar, all the things that we know are not so good for us. And it's low in vitamins and minerals and fiber and phytochemicals, all the things that we know are good for us. So this Western diet is being exported across the world, and it's kind of a symptom of countries rising out of poverty. That as countries rise out of poverty, they eat more like us. So we're seeing specific countries where they're, for example, India and China, where they're tripling. For example, in China, they're tripling their meat intake, and we're seeing a rate rise in obesity and diabetes, for example. And we're seeing in India more Western diet and obesity and diabetes rising there. And we're seeing it in all over the world. We're seeing it in parts of South America as well. But when we look at the original diet, we call these diets indigenous traditional diets. So if you can find countries around the world, and this is part of what the blue zones did, when you can find countries where they still eat an unprocessed diet the way they've been eating for hundreds and hundreds of years, whether it be in West Africa or Peru, in the Sacred Valley of Peru, or in parts of Asia, or in Crete, Greece. If you can find these little places, people eat a primarily plant-based diet, whole foods, nothing comes out of a package. It's seasonal, what is available in the region. They're often considered to be the poor man's diet, but it's actually the healthiest diet because it's packed with foods that they grow in their own gardens. They trade with their neighbors. They even forage still. They still go in the forest and forage. And these are the diets that have very low disease risks, such as heart disease, diabetes, and cancer.
We got to go back to those traditional ways of food preparation and traditional ways of eating. However long we've been here, whether it's millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years, or thousands of years, uh, we were doing something right because we survived all this time, and I'm afraid for where we're going. It's only been the last 100 years that we've had allopathic, chemical based, pharmaceutical medicine, and now it's only taken a few generations for people to reach for the Advil before they, or reach for whatever medication before they go, wait a second, like maybe I'm dehydrated, maybe I didn't eat enough protein or whatever. Just start to trace back and go, what's the root cause of this headache? Listening to the body and using the body's symptoms to speak to us. is how we maintain our own health, and yet we've kind of given it up for the pill. And same with the food, we've given up the taking the 15 to 30 minutes to prepare food for the whatever we can throw in the microwave, and now we're seeing all this disease come to a forefront. I'm so thrilled that you are one of the pioneers to shout from the mountaintops and share this information. You've been teaching this for over 15 years now, how we can live for our health and also for the health of the planet. And I applaud you for all the work you do. It's really exciting work. I'd love for you to wrap up our interview um, by talking about your books. I think they're so important. I'd love to know a bit about them, and who should buy each one. Is there a particular type of reader or someone with certain concerns that should buy Plant Powered for Life or the Plant Powered Diet, or they go well together?
Yes. Well, my first book was The Plant Powered Diet. And that I kind of feel that it's the Bible of plant based eating. It kind of has everything you need to know. And it again, is kind of matches my philosophy that everybody can have benefits from eating whole plant foods. So even if you're an omnivore, all the way to a vegan who's eating a more processed diet, we can all gain benefits by eating more whole plants. So I really go through all the science and all of those health benefits, as well as practical tips in each of the areas. For example, proteins. How can you plan meals involved with plant proteins, and how can you make sure your grains are whole, and like how many types of vegetables should you have, what types should you have during the day, that kind of thing. So I really consider it to be kind of a guide for plant-based eating. And my second book is called Plant Powered for Life, and that is more of a cookbook with easy tips. So if you really didn't want all of this condensed, and more of a condensed version of the first book, so you had more easy to follow tips rather than the large information on eating a more plant-based diet. The second book, Plant Power for Life, would really have those easy tips with lots of recipes, with color photography. So I kind of think of it more as a cookbook. So a lot of times people like both of them. But if you're really interested in more of the easy tips with cooking, then the second book Plant Powered for Life would be your choice.
So if you don't have enough time, you're already convinced, and you just want to jump in and start cooking, get Plant Powered for Life. But if you love to kick back and read all the science and geek out on it, like I do, read the Plant Powered Diet.
Yes.
Or if you want to convince a loved one, maybe you should arm yourself with all the information in the Plant Powered Diet. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true.
And then, because obviously a listener is going to have to, if a listener is not single, if they have a family, or if they live with people that they communally eat with, they're going to have to convince the family to get on board. And so, are there some tips in the plant powered diet that would help them to convince their family this is a good thing?
Yeah, I really have a lot of the motivation behind it is in the plant-powered diet. So I talk about, the environmental benefits, the health benefits, the animal welfare benefits from reducing animal food consumption and eating more whole plants. So it would give you that background of knowledge, and it's all evidence-based. I'm really big on the evidence-based. Um, but then some people really like more of a culinary approach. So the Plant Powered for Life book has more of that focus on culinary with just the easy little tips.
Very cool. Now, I actually just stumbled upon today a comment. One of my friends just went vegan, and they said, I haven't eaten meat in a week, and now I'm just craving it so much right now. What do I do? So if someone does cut out meat, but and they begin to get all these cravings, are the cravings? What are the cravings? Is it a detox? Is the body um, telling us we're missing something? How do you help people move through meat cravings?
Well, first of all, I kind of like to look at how balanced their diet is. If it's really not balanced, then they could be feeling cravings just because they're physically hungry. When you're eating a vegan diet, it's quite possible that you're not getting enough calories. Even if you're not doing it right, you could be eating half the calories that you need. And you could be short on fat and protein. So physically, you could be not getting the nutrients that you need to feel satisfied. And, you could still be feeling this hunger. I think it's quite common among people who take a challenge or who, just go cold turkey and eat a vegan diet. It's quite common to have symptoms of, I've heard it expressed as just never feeling full. I feel so hungry, like my body's so hungry. And I think that's kind of a transition because the diet has a different composition. It's much lower in fat overall. It's higher in fiber. So the fiber is really, your whole diet system is changing. So you're getting so much more fiber and everything is going through more quickly. And it's digesting a lot more quickly. So you may feel like lighter. These are more subjective terms, but this is very common. And in fact, when I tried it the first time, I shared some of those symptoms, and I went from vegetarian to vegan as a challenge, just to see how I felt. So I know what some of those things feel like. But I think the number one thing to do is make sure your diet is balanced. And then if you are having cravings, look at those particular foods. For example, there are so many different types of products now that are available. Even though I don't recommend that your diet should be filled with processed, prepared vegan foods, there are some really satisfying meat alternatives. Many of them, like Beyond Meat, Gardein, those are just a couple of products out there that really have kind of that texture and flavor and can kind of replicate meat on the plate. And I think these are great gateway foods to help people eat more plant-based. And that's one of the reasons that I like to kind of recommend those as options. Not that your diet should subsist on those every single day, but they can kind of help that transition.
So I have a beef to pick with, or a bone to pick. I have a beef with tofurkey. Tofurkey, is that, am I saying it right? It's a tofu turkey substitute. Because I looked at the ingredients on it, and it is the most processed food I've ever seen. The ingredients are a mile long, and it includes like lots of gluten and just weird chemicals, like just artificial. It is, I mean, as far as meat substitutes go, it does not look healthier than eating meat.
Yeah, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine as well. And a lot of people just live on these things, and I always wonder, what is the benefit from that? Because these are highly processed foods, and the benefit of a plant-based diet is when we're eating all these whole foods. So I always like to encourage people, it's fine to have these every once in a while. And then the other thing I like to do is encourage people to find a couple of brands that they really like the label. There are some new products out there that have very clean labels. And if you look at the ingredients, there are things that you could find in your own kitchen. And those could be your go-to products that you might have around for those busy nights when you can't quite get dinner on the table. Or like one of the things I like to do is bring my own veggie burgers to a barbecue if I'm going to someone's house in the summer. So those kinds of things, finding like products that you really like, and those are kind of your go-to. And then really trying to eat whole foods most of the time.
Very cool. I'm originally Canadian and haven't been there in a while, but for those Canadian listeners, President's Choice has a brand of vegan burgers which is out of this world. What's really cool is it's a patty, burger patty, and you just see what's in it. You can see there's corn and beans and peas, and they just mushed it together into a burger, but you can see all the ingredients. It's the most delicious, and it's really delicious actually. And I don't know how they got it to mold together, probably with gluten, but I love those vegan burgers where it's like what's in it, like it's a black bean burger, or it's a. Do you ever make your own? Do you ever make your own vegan burgers?
I was just going to say that I'm seeing this big trend where everybody's making their own veggie burgers now. And I'm seeing it at restaurants too, where when they put a veggie burger on the menu, it's not like some frozen one, they're making their own. And it's surprisingly easy. I have several recipes for them. But my recipe is kind of a variation. It always has a bean that's I mash, and then I have some kind of grain, whether it's quinoa or brown rice. And then I usually grate some carrots in there. And I use oats as kind of as a stabilizer, and then flax seeds, which actually also acts as kind of a stabilizer and holds
Mm.
it together. And then I let it soak a little bit. Of course, I add herbs and spices and garlic. I let it soak a little bit for an hour in the refrigerator so it kind of gets thick, and you can shape it into a burger that will hold up in a skillet over a grill or to bake. So, and you can make a batch of those and put them in the freezer or keep them in the fridge and heat them up. But they're so good.
Awesome. And those recipes are in your books?
I have some of those recipes. I have a recipe actually in my new book, Plant Powered for Life. And I also have lots of recipes on my website at sharonpalmer.com too.
Yes, and the links to everything that Sharon does is going to be in the show notes of today's podcast. You have a store, I'm looking at it right now on your site, where you sell, you've got both books for a bargain deal. Oh, and it comes with a t-shirt. So that's very cool. And so you sell your books on your website. So listeners, definitely check that out. And then you've got a blog, a really fun blog. And then people can work with you. What does it look like to work with you?
Yeah, I just do lots of fun projects with different organizations. Like I've done work with the American Institute for Cancer Research, developing recipes. As I mentioned before, they're really big into plant-based nutrition. Not that, they don't recommend that people have to be vegan, but just all of us getting on this spectrum of eating more plants. So, I've just done a lot of great work with lots of organizations that I admire, getting out this message of eating more whole foods and that are more sustainably grown and better for our health and the health of the planet. So, yeah, and then I have lots of resources, free resources on my blog, like recipes and seasonal produce guides if you want to know what's in season during certain times of the year. You can get my books there. And I also have a free newsletter that people can sign up for. So then you would get recipes and articles and things like that about nutrition.
Very cool. So, could someone hire you to work with them one on one, or is this more you work with organizations?
I don't do very much one-on-one personal consultation anymore. I'm mostly working. I do a lot of events in the community. I did an amazing event recently where we did a nutrition education in the middle of a farm, for example. So I do a lot of speaking events where we can talk about, eating more whole plant foods and culinary demonstrations, things like that. But right now, I'm not really doing a lot of individual one-on-one consultation.
Well, it's very cool. So, if a listener has an organization and they'd like you to come teach and do some cooking demonstrations and talk, then you can do that.
Exactly.
Very cool. It has been such a pleasure having you here today. I'm on your blog right now. I'm seeing some delicious posts. So I definitely recommend listeners check out SharonPalmer.com. And again, I love that you're not shaming people out of eating meat or telling people to stop altogether, but you are continually encouraging them to go eat, have more and more of their plate, have vegetables and fruit and the whole foods, because we can crowd out the processed foods instead of thinking about limiting ourselves. When we think about a diet, think of the word die, like, oh my gosh, I can't eat this, I can't eat that. But instead focusing on what we can eat, and you've mentioned all these wonderful things we can eat, the nuts, the seeds, the legumes, the beans, all the vegetables, all the fruit, and there's thousands and thousands of options when it comes to that. And then if someone wants to continue eating animal protein, that can be such a significantly smaller portion of their plate, because their plate is filled with this rich, nutrient dense foods that are minimally processed, and is more satiating because the body has all that fiber and all the nutrients. When you eat something that's processed, there's less nutrients, so it's less satiating. Is that correct?
Yes, you said that so well. I love this idea of it's not what you're avoiding, it's what you are eating. So when you eat a plant-based diet, you're just like filling it to the brim with all of these foods that are good for us. They fill you up, like you mentioned. They add all these nutrients and antioxidants to our diet, and it's just putting more emphasis on that rather than this diet of high animal foods, highly processed foods, fast foods, prepared foods, all of those things.
Wonderful. Excellent. Well, it's been a pleasure having you here today. I'd love to have you come back anytime you want to continue to teach and share with our listeners. It has been a true pleasure. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. Your books sound wonderful, and I can't wait to read them.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure being here today, too, talking with you. I think we have common interests in wellness and health for sure.
Enjoy what you heard today on your episode of the Learn True Health podcast. Did something move you, inspire you? Did you get great information that's going to change your life? Awesome. That's exactly what I'm here to do, is to help you gain your health back. Please turn around and share this. If this is something that's helped you in any way, share this with those you love. Love the Learn True Health podcast and want to support us? Awesome. You can go to takeyoursupplements.com and you can support us that way. You'll get access to amazing supplements that are just really great quality for a great price. And there'll be someone on the other end of the line to help you pick out your supplements that are right for you. That's takeyoursupplements.com. Or join our membership, learntruehealth.com/join. That's another great way to support our podcast, support our movement, and you'll be supporting yourself. Gain more information, wonderful videos, wonderful trainings, and you'll also be able to share those with those you love as well. So go to learntruehealth.com/join. Want something fun for free? Go to learntruehealth.com, and right there on the front page, you'll see where you can get our free cookbook. I spent a lot of time making it, and it was so much fun. It's really delicious, healthy recipes. And you can also get our 7-day doctor course. Right there, it's 7 days of naturopathic videos sent right to your inbox, and you can learn from top naturopaths on how to gain health naturally. So that's takeyoursupplements.com for wonderful supplements. learntruehealth.com/join to join our awesome membership, which is only open for a limited time. You can get our free healthy cookbook, and you can also get for free 7 days of wonderful naturopathic videos sent to you. Just go to learntruehealth.com and you'll see it right there on the front page. Thank you so much for being a listener, and thank you for sharing and helping others. Let's spread this information and turn this ripple into a tidal wave.